The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
So, there's no way, I apologize in advance, that this talk can be as interesting as what you hear in the news every day now. But we're going to try and give it a go. And what the point of the talk is that through Albany, people have sought the presidency more than we really think about. I mean, there's the surface look at it, at the guys who succeeded and then the guys who didn't succeed and who were talked about. And it goes all the way back to the foundations of the American Republic. In 1791, Jefferson and Madison travel by sloop up to Albany, and they confer with Chancellor Robert Livingston and also with Aaron Burr. And they are laying the groundwork of the National Democratic Party. It starts that early. And in 1792, the first New Yorker gets electoral votes for the presidency of the United States. And that's a sort of situation because the Constitution has not been particularly well thought out in that regard. People don't know if they're voting for president or vice president, and that's not going to be resolved until after the embarrassment of the election of 1800. And so the person who gets those votes is George Clinton. Now, this is not the George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic. This is the George Clinton who was governor of New York State for 21 years, which was the national record until Terry Branstad beat that out in Iowa just recently. He is going to become vice president of the United States, but in the interim, in 1796, another New Yorker gets votes that way, and that is Aaron Burr himself. Aaron Burr was a New York City boy, but he had some operations in Albany. He had been an assemblyman early on in the 1790s, although that precedes working out of Albany, because Albany is not the state capital until 1797. Burr goes on, he leaves the assembly, and he becomes a United States senator. But he finds that to be boring and returns to the New York State Assembly. As a New York State Assemblyman, what he does, in part, is organizing the votes to beat the Federalists in the 1800 election. And the electoral votes, the assembly votes, because it's going to be done through the New York State Legislature, it's at large in Manhattan. New York State still has residence or property qualifications for voting. And what Burr is going to do is some fancy legal work. You're going to own a square foot of Manhattan, and you're going to own the next one. And everyone gets a square foot of land, and everyone gets to vote for the Democratic Republicans under Aaron Burr. And he becomes a power broker, but he doesn't get as many votes as he thinks he should in that election. Becomes embittered with Thomas Jefferson, becomes embittered with Alexander Hamilton, and there is that famous duel. And that's set off. Now Hamilton never runs for the presidency, but you can't escape Alexander Hamilton these days. And so he is married at the Schuyler Mansion down in the south end of Albany. His father-in-law is Philip Schuyler. He had met his bride 2 years earlier, Betsy Schuyler, at the Schuyler Mansion. But in 1801 or 1804, I believe, there's an article published in the Albany Register, which reveals some of the correspondence of Alexander Hamilton about Burr, and that leads to the duel, which changes American history and ends the career of both the duelists, Burr and Hamilton. Now, George Clinton is the vice president for 2 terms. Might have gone on for a 3rd term. He sought the presidency at one point earlier. His nephew, DeWitt Clinton, and this is before he becomes governor of New York and starting the canal, runs for the vice presidency as a Federalist. George Clinton had been a Democratic Republican, but DeWitt Clinton runs for the presidency in 1812. If he had flipped a couple of states, he would have been the president that year. He is not, goes on to become governor. A lot of these folks end up tragically in one way or the other, and not just Alexander Hamilton, but also DeWitt Clinton. He dies impoverished, and he is buried on Pearl Street in Albany, New York. There's a graveyard there. Eventually they say, he's DeWitt Clinton. He's a famous guy, and he's a New York City guy. So he is reinterred. If you're wondering why he's not in the Albany Rural Cemetery, he can now be found in Albany, or in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. Now, in 1820, Daniel D. Tompkins, you've heard of Tompkins County, Tompkins Square Park down in New York City. He is a former governor. He's elected vice president of the United States. He's the only vice president to serve 2 terms, 2 full terms in the 19th century, or until Woodrow Wilson's vice president in 1912 and 1916. Tompkins dies very soon after leaving the vice presidency. He's the youngest vice president, ex-president to die. He's only 50 years old at that time, and hastening his demise is the stress of the work, which leads to alcoholism, but also he's sort of battling the deep state in Washington and over appointments. He's backing a fellow named Solomon Southwick, who is for the job of postmaster of Albany. People want to throw Southwick out. Southwick had been accused of misappropriation of funds. Earlier, he had been placed on trial for the alleged bribery of a Speaker of the Assembly. Some things change and don't change in Albany. It was his paper. He was a newspaper man, and the confluence of newspapers and politics in the United States and in Albany is very pronounced for a long period of our history. And Southwick is the fellow whose newspaper had published those Alexander Hamilton letters that led to the duel. Now, the big gun finally arrives. We're kind of through talking about the people that no one remembers, at least for a while. And it's Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren serves in a variety of offices in Albany before becoming tapped, and he becomes governor. But he doesn't serve as governor very long. He's from Kinderhook, as you know. He was married down in Catskill, New York. He becomes Secretary of State under Andrew Jackson. The vice presidency is not a big deal job for most of our history, and the route, particularly before the Civil War, to the presidency is through the State Department. If you are Secretary of State, you are on that escalator upward towards the White House. And he is on that escalator. He's detoured for a while. He's made minister to France. We didn't have ambassadors at that point. We had ministers, but the Senate rejects him. But Andrew Jackson is not to be trifled with. He does make Van Buren vice president to give him some great visibility, and he becomes president, but his presidency is derailed in 1837 with the Panic of 1837. He tries a comeback later on as a member or nominee of the Free Soil Party. Does not go very far in that. He's known as the Little Fox of Kinderhook. He has the Albany machine, a statewide machine though, not a local machine. It's called the Albany Regency. And after Van Buren, you see people like William L. Marcy as governor. Marcy is thought to be a presidential candidate. He becomes Secretary of State. He's Mount Marcy. He's Marcy State Hospital. And perhaps the most significant thing about him is that he's the one who coins the phrase, "To the victor belongs the spoils," which is should be the motto of Albany or state government here. most of these guys are Democrats. The Democrats are doing very well in state government at that time, but there's a fellow who comes into the New York Assembly for 3 one-year terms early in his career. He's thought of as a Western New York guy, but he does arrive in Albany to serve in the Assembly, and his name is Millard Fillmore. Fillmore wants to be governor. Eventually he becomes state controller, and that's how he rises from that to the vice presidency. But his career is blocked by a fellow who is very connected to Albany, and his name is Thurlow Weed. He's one of those newspaper guys. He runs the Albany Journal at that point. His great pal and ally in politics is William Seward, Lincoln's future Secretary of State. Now, Fillmore and Weed really don't like each other. And even after Fillmore goes to Washington yet again to be Vice President of the United States of America, he's funding an anti-Whig newspaper at that time. So imagine the Vice President of the United States interjecting themselves in local Albany politics and doing that. Fillmore becomes President of the United States on the death of Zachary Taylor. But his presidency is not a success, but he comes back to Albany. And this is the second prominent wedding ceremony at the Schuyler Mansion. He comes back because he's marrying the 45-year-old widow of a very prominent Troy businessman who actually was the president of the Albany-Schenectady Railroad, or Schenectady-Troy Railroad, excuse me. Now, the really interesting thing about this wedding is that the bride insists on a prenup agreement with the former president of the United States. They moved back to Buffalo. I don't think they're seen again in Albany. He runs again for the presidency, however, as we know, as the candidate of the Know Nothing Party in 1856, gets about 20% of the vote. I was looking at the electoral map this morning, mostly in the South and the border states, oddly enough. Carries Maryland. Now, there's another, Seward. Seward is very interesting because Seward is not an Albanian. He does serve in the state legislature, and that's how he meets Thurlow Weed. But he goes to Union College, as you may know. And in his memoirs, he really recounts what it was like to see Albany for the first time. And he saw it coming up the river on the boat from the south. He said, "Have I ever seen in afterlife," he means to say afterwards, "a city so vast, so splendid, so imposing as Albany. That then loomed up before me. Not Paris, not Benares, not even Constantinople inspired me with so much awe." Moving on to Schenectady, however, he passed through not Colonie, as far as I can tell, but through Guilderland, of which he was far less impressed, which he described as a sandy and almost sterile plain without culture or dwellings, except for the frequent taverns. And yes, when he got to Schenectady, he wasn't particularly impressed with Schenectady either. He's a bit like, he wants to be president. The situation is like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, actually. In that Seward is the big national figure of his party, the Whigs and then the Republicans. He should have the nomination, but he takes it a little too easy. He goes off to Europe to kind of hide from the issues, and he loses to this interloper, this relatively unknown person from Illinois called Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln is certainly not from Albany, New York, but we're going to include him in this talk, although the road to the White House literally leads through Albany for Lincoln, and he's Lincoln, so we're going to do the Lincoln exemption. And that is in February 1861, He's not there yet, but somebody else has arrived in Albany, and that's John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth is appearing in the south end of the little theater called the Gaiety Theater on Green Street, with a tiny stage, 600-seat theater, 7x9 stage. And you may recall ordering, when you were a kid, from a comic book or somewhere, a trick disposable or a retractable knife. It would go in and you go, and fool everyone. Really not. But so Booth was going to use this as a prop on the stage. And it's not made of plastic. There's no plastic then, kids. Don't try this trick at home. And it doesn't retract. And it goes into his chest, cutting 3 inches of flesh, which means he cannot move on to his next appearance on the John Wilkes Booth Roadshow. So he's staying at the Hotel Stanwix in Albany when Abraham Lincoln moves through town. This is their first sort of confluence. We don't know for sure if he saw Lincoln process down to where he was staying at the Hotel Delavan, more towards Pearl Street and the train station. But we do know he was talking up Confederate politics or pro-Southern things because some locals told him to stuff it. Now, they meet again, of course, at Ford's Theater, and there's another Albany connection, which is Lincoln wants to go to the theater on Good Friday, and nobody wants to go with him. General Grant doesn't want to go with him. He invites New York State's United States Senator Ira Harris, who is from Albany, to go with him, and Ira Harris does not want to go. But Harris's daughter, Claire, does attend with Lincoln. She's in the box as John Wilkes Booth comes in, and so is her fiancé. And his name is Henry Rathbone, and he's an Army officer of the Union Army. His father had been the first popularly elected mayor of Albany. She was the United States Senator's daughter. Her mother had died. His father had died. And so the two surviving parents had married. They were step-sister and stepbrother and fiancés. Okay? Rathbone attempts to stop Booth. I mean, it's all over at that point. Lincoln has been shot. Booth has a knife with him. There are a lot of knives in this Booth story, and stabs Rathbone. His blood goes onto his fiance's dress. She keeps that forever. It's a white satin dress. They had a cottage out in Loudonville, in Colonie, I guess, which she claimed she would see the ghost of Lincoln. Rathbone is haunted by the fact that he should have done something to save Lincoln, which is, of course, impossible. But in his mind, it just roils with him forever. He becomes greatly disturbed, and after the Civil War, he receives an appointment, a diplomatic appointment to be a representative to the German state of Hanover, which isn't even an independent state at that time. It's part of Prussia. This is before German unification. So he's sent over there, and at some point, he snaps. He snaps, and he shoots and stabs his wife dead, and then stabs himself 5 times. He is put into a German mental asylum, dies in 1911. They are buried together in Germany. But in Germany, the cemeteries are so crowded, unless you have some special pull, you don't stay buried. And they were removed. They were removed, and no one's quite sure where they are to this day. So a very, very sad and poignant story in that regard. After the Civil War, I mentioned Chester Alan Arthur. Now, U.S. Grant. Both Lincoln and Grant come back through Albany after their death. Lincoln is on his way to Springfield, Illinois. Grant is on his way back from from Wilton, New York, outside of Saratoga, and the when Lincoln, there's another irony. As his body comes into the train station around 11 p.m. that night to be laid in state at the old state capitol, 6 white horses carry his hearse in from there. He's on view all night, and then his body is set once again on a train to go westward. But it is on that day that William L. Seward, as Secretary of State, makes the announcement that the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth is over. It has come full circle and through Albany. That Chester Arthur fellow I told you about, of course, has connections throughout this entire area. He's born in Vermont, but he goes to school at Union College. There's a statue of him there. He is taught at Scaticoke and in Pownell, Vermont. He was a principal of a little school there. His father was a Baptist minister at all sorts of places. Arthur taught for a while also in Cohoes, which his sister Malvina referred to once in her writings as a little dirty cubbyhole. She did not care for that place at all. Arthur's mother, by the way, died in Newtonville. So his first wife was from up in Saratoga County. And when she dies, he is in Albany doing state business and has to go back. He does hold a number of state offices in Albany because his wife comes originally from Virginia, and so he doesn't want to fight his in-laws. You know, it is a brother and brother-in-law against brother-in-law, so sort of war in that thing. But he is, because she dies, he has no first lady when he becomes president of the United States. And his sister, who is the wife of a prominent Albany insurance man, she takes over. Now, both Mr. and Mrs. Arthur and Arthur's sister, they're all buried in Albany Rural Cemetery, as so many of these folks are. But intervening beyond that, there's a series of Democratic governors who are looking at the presidency or who are nominated. Horatio Seymour had won and lost for the governorship, some very tight races. He's nominated against U.S. Grant the first time Grant runs and is defeated. In the next year, or in 1876, you see a couple of Albanians or Albany-connected people running. One is Roscoe Conklin, who is like, no, he's not from Albany. Yes, he is from Albany. He was born in Albany. He was a congressman from Utica at that time. His father had been a judge in Albany, and also the district attorney of Montgomery County. But he gets a few votes in 76. He doesn't get the nomination for the Republicans. He's a pro-Grant Republican, and Grant has sort of worn out his welcome, that faction in the Republican Party at that time. But Samuel B. Tilden, who was out towards the Massachusetts border and had been governor of the state, had been an assemblyman a couple of times, big anti-corruption, anti-Tweed, anti-Tammany Democrat. He is defeated by Rutherford B. Hayes in the so-called corrupt bargain, where he wins the electoral vote, and to facilitate the end of Reconstruction in the South, the election goes to Hayes. By the way, his family had made their money originally by selling patent medicine. One of the ingredients was cannabis. So, so things go all the way around. Hayes's vice president is a fellow named William Wheeler, who had served also in Albany. When the Democrats finally, after trying many times to nominate someone and get the presidency, succeed with Grover Cleveland. He's the governor of New York State. We know a few things about what he was up to in Albany. He attended the Presbyterian Church, the Fourth Presbyterian Church, kind of on Pearl Street, which is long since demolished. But at night, on evenings, he would go to the new executive mansion and would go from there to the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. So a very ecumenical sort of guy. When he is first elected, the presidents don't take office until March. There's an interregnum between leaving the governorship and assuming the presidency. He's got nowhere to live. He doesn't want to go back to Buffalo, and rents a row house on Willett Street in Albany near Washington Park. He comes back to Albany later on for a celebration of the centennial or whatever anniversary of Albany. He actually comes back, one of the few who does, and talks to the assembly and the assembly chamber, and also at the Fort Orange Club. Now, his vice president, or lieutenant governor rather, is a fellow named David B. Hill. David B. Hill was famous for saying, "I am a Democrat." I'm not quite sure why that caught on so much, as opposed to "I am a Republican" or "I am a Whig," but that was his message, and it served him to the lieutenant governorship and the U.S. senatorship, and but not for the presidency. He tries to get in 1892 when Cleveland is mounting his comeback. He doesn't go far. Cleveland and Hill do not like each other. They're both very conservative Democrats. All these Democrats after the Civil War are very conservative. Seymour and Tilden and Cleveland and Hill. The New York State Democratic Party is a far different party than what it is now, or even what it was for most of the 20th century. But Hill is most noted, I think, to this audience, or what the connection would be, is that same year of 1892, he buys a home out in the town of Colonie and names it Wolfert's Roost. Okay, that's his home. He named it, and it's the big country club to this day. Now, after Cleveland comes William McKinley. What's his connection to Albany? After the Civil War, must have been some sort of like GI Bill of Rights going on. He goes to Albany Law School, and he graduates within a year from there, and goes back to Ohio and works his way up the political ladder. His vice president, as we know, is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is elected to the assembly at a very early age, like 22 years old, 23 years old, and he comes in a very Theodore Roosevelt sort of way. He's a big reformer. There's one of these impasses in organizing the assembly at that time, and gives a lot of speeches that only a 23-year-old could give. I mean, and he's when he's not doing that, he's actually punching out fellow members of the assembly. There's a butcher from East 21st Street in Manhattan named James J. Costello, and he decks him. But Wilson or Roosevelt is a big boxer. He will later box in the executive mansion in Albany, in the White House, where he loses an eye in a boxing match. He's the advocate of the strenuous life. When he comes back to Albany once again after the Spanish-American War, and he does this because the Republican Party knows to hang on to power in the governor's mansion, it has to put forward a fresh face, a reformer. He's the guy. There have been scandals with the barge canal, with the Erie Canal, and they have to get Roosevelt in, and he wins very narrowly. When he's here, he goes to church down at the First Reformed Church near the Palace Theater. His wife is Episcopalian. She goes to the Episcopalian Church here. And he, of course, he kind of wears out his welcome in the assembly very quickly with his fellow Republicans. I think there's only one way to recognize this or think about this, because he's in for a year. They make him, after he's punched out everyone, they determine that's a great qualification to be Republican minority leader. So he's Republican minority leader for a year, but then they regain the majority. and they don't make him the speaker. They don't make him the leader. They put a rather elderly assemblyman from Little Falls to replace him. And the most charming thing about him is, you've all heard the expression, you can go to hell and wait. This guy married hell and wait. So when you're beaten by someone like that, I don't know. But he wears out his welcome, of course, in the Republican Party as well, with splitting the Republican Party wide open in 1912, leading to the election of Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson faces re-election in 1916, and Albany comes back into prominence that same year on both ends of the political spectrum. One of which is that the governor of New York, or ex-governor of New York, is a fellow named Martin H. Glynn. He's the first Catholic governor of New York. And what he does is he shows up to give a stem-winding speech at a rather otherwise dull Democratic convention. It's really, I think it's only like 2 days or something in St. Louis. And he says, he kept us out of war, which becomes the Democratic rallying point for Wilson and really carries him over the finish line in 1916. Glynn, like some of those other fellows earlier in the story who don't end well, does not end well. He has some diplomatic successes afterwards with, say, Irish independence. And he's a newspaper man too. He's a newspaper man, and he had been, I think, with the Times Union. This is the first time the Times Union shows up in the story. Previous newspaper people in this story also involve Daniel Manning, okay, like Manning Boulevard. Daniel Manning ran the Albany Argus. You can still see the Albany Argus building way downtown in Albany, the Democratic paper. He was the original booster of Grover Cleveland. So that when Cleveland becomes president of the United States, Daniel Manning becomes Treasury Secretary. He's buried up in Albany Rural Cemetery as well. And another newspaper person, William Barnes, who is the grandson of Thurlow Weed, is the leader of the Barnes machine, which preceded the Albany Democratic machine. He was a very conservative Republican, hated Theodore Roosevelt, and determined to break him. With a lawsuit after Roosevelt had essentially called him a crook. And Barnes responded with, "I'm not a crook," and sued, and thought he could bring suit in Albany County, where his control over everything was really very tight and very intriguing. The Saturday Evening Post ran a big expose of the Barnes machine in Albany about this time and said how it worked. And they controlled all the offices except one. There was one judgeship, one Democrat judgeship they could not knock out. So Barnes, through his influence in the state legislature, and I think that the story was, there's a Barnes man hanging on to every doorknob in the Capitol. In other words, patronage, patronage, patronage. But he got a bill through the legislature in Albany and signed by the governor, which said that if you wanted to, you could request to be tried in another court rather than by this Democrat judge. Imagine a system with that much power in the state level to basically, rig the judicial system. The other thing they did was to control the jury pool in Albany, which was that if you faced a jury, every person in that box would essentially be a Republican office holder. Okay, it is hard to imagine 12 Republican office holders in Albany County today, but they stacked it pretty much that way. He loses the case against Roosevelt. Roosevelt turns all his charm on, and also Roosevelt has wisely gotten, they changed the venue to Syracuse, where oddly enough the judge was his classmate at Harvard. But he wins that, and Roosevelt has to determine how to bring the Republican Party back to 1916. and it's not easy. It's a civil war. Everybody hates everybody at that point. They're very wary. And about the only guy that the Republican Party can turn to, and he's been out of politics for a while because he's been on the Supreme Court bench, is Charles Evans Hughes, originally born in Glens Falls, New York, served as governor. He's elected the governorship by beating yet another one of these very political newspaper guys. And that guy is William Randolph Hearst, okay? He and Roosevelt very quickly had turned on each other regarding the replacement of the insurance commissioner in Albany. It's a very complicated story, but Roosevelt really dislikes Hughes. But he's willing to accept him in 1916, and Hughes is the nominee. He loses very narrowly to Woodrow Wilson that year. Also in regard to Theodore Roosevelt is his 1904 opponent. His 1904 opponent is, again, one of those very conservative Democrats. He's Alton B. Parker, a judge on the state Supreme Court. He's from Esopus, down by Kingston. And in fact, when Theodore Roosevelt is wondering whether he should accept the nomination for the vice presidency in 1900 under McKinley and whether it will be tendered to him, Alton B. Parker is dining at the executive mansion with Mrs. Roosevelt and says, of course he's going to be nominated. So that's why they call it Smallbany, folks. So everyone's hanging out with everyone else. In 1923, a fellow we don't associate with Albany at all, Vice President Calvin Coolidge blows into town, and he's addressing the New York State Convention of the Young Men's Christian Association, which is holding its meetings at Chancellor's Hall at the Education Building, and then holding a banquet at the ballroom of the Ten Eyck Hotel. And in April 1923, all the papers nationwide are carrying rumors that he's going to be dumped from the Republican ticket. Now, whether his talk in Albany reverses his political fortunes and changes history, I'm not sure. I think probably that Warren Harding died in office that August had a hell of a lot more to do with it. But Coolidge moves on from there. A politician more associated with the Ten Eyck Hotel is Alfred Emanuel Smith, who comes into Albany in 1904. He's uneducated. He's not particularly well-bred. His pronunciation leaves a lot to be desired. But he holes up in his room there and reads all the bills, reads all the procedures. If you want to know the real facts of the matter in Albany, of what the bills are going to do, you go to this guy. It takes him a couple of years to really get up and running this way, but very soon he's a powerhouse in that assembly. He becomes Speaker of the Assembly. He's nominated for president in 1928. He's been placed in nomination that year by Franklin D. Roosevelt and placed in nomination 4 years earlier, again by Franklin Roosevelt. In 1928, what they have is a custom, which is going to last until not much longer, really, where you don't accept the nomination. You aren't formally notified of the presidential nomination for a few weeks afterwards, and they take it to you. They bring it to your hometown or wherever you live or whatever place you choose. So Calvin Coolidge is notified in Northampton, Massachusetts, and Warren Harding is notified in Marion, Ohio. So they nominate or they notify Al Smith in 1928 at the New York State Capitol. Okay, and the groundbreaking thing here is this is the first television broadcast of its sort. His acceptance from the Assembly chamber is broadcast by whatever they were calling WXYZ 2810 810 WGY was. Okay. Now, who was watching this broadcast in 1928? I don't know. I saw another newspaper article about television in Schenectady at this time that said there were 3 sets held up, but I'm sure the ratings were terrific. Okay. Now, in that same year of 1928, he, to protect his flank in New York State, needs to run someone for governor. Needs a good, strong Democratic candidate. There are a couple of fellows who might have run, one of which is Mayor Corning's, the Mayor Corning's father, Edwin Corning. He had been lieutenant governor, but his health is rather bad. In fact, he's going to be dead in a few years, so he can't take it. William Stormont Hackett had been mayor of Albany. He was one of the earliest Democratic mayors. He wanted to be the nominee for governor at some point, but he is vacationing in Puerto Rico, and his car overturns and he's killed. So he's out of the way. So there could have been two Albanians succeeding Smith, and maybe going on to the White House in 1932, but it turns out to be Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt comes in sort of the same way Theodore Roosevelt comes in. He's elected to the state Senate. There's an impasse in the legislature over choosing a United States senator, because that's how it's done then. He turns to advice to Al Smith. Okay? It's like, well, if we attend the caucus meeting and we lose, are we obligated to go in there and vote for the guy that Tammany Hall wants? And Smith, who is as Tammany as they come, but also a guy whose word you can take to the bank, says, you can vote any way you want if you don't go to the meeting. And they don't go to the meeting, and they hold out, and there's this big impasse. And the impasse makes Franklin Roosevelt's reputation statewide. But, he lives, this is, well, getting ahead of the story. He is nominated in 1932. He breaks that precedent. He flies out of Albany from a mail plane, and by mail I don't mean as opposed to a female plane, but something carrying the mail. They pack about 9 or 10 staff members, and it takes 9 hours to get from Albany to Chicago. This is only a few years after Lindbergh. They have to stop in Buffalo. They have to stop in Cleveland. It's a good thing that Franklin Roosevelt was so nautical, because one of his sons gets airsick on the plane and FDR doesn't. But when he's nominated, Al Smith by this time and Roosevelt have broken seriously. Smith thought he was going to be the power behind the throne, the power behind the wheelchair. He thought that Roosevelt was too infirm, too much of a lightweight to function as governor, and he takes his old room back, or he takes a room back at the Ten Eyck and says, I'm here. Whenever you need any advice, you can count on me. Franklin Roosevelt doesn't want advice from Al Smith. He's going to be his own man, and he specifically doesn't want advice about two things. One is keeping Al Smith's secretary on, like secretary of the governor, a very powerful woman named Belle Moskowitz, really the first woman who holds hands-on political power, aside from being an advocate for something, but really being in the inner sanctum of a politician. Smith wants her to stay on. Roosevelt says no, and puts forward a really terrible excuse as to why he can't keep her on. I have trouble getting around, Al. I need a big, strong man to help me. And so he takes this non-entity assemblyman from, I think, Orange County, who was eventually indicted, to be his secretary instead of Belle Moskowitz. And Smith also wants his Secretary of State to be kept on under Roosevelt. And that fellow's name is Robert Moses. But Moses and Roosevelt really hate each other. And so that does not happen at all. Smith challenges FDR, or they challenge each other for the nomination in 1932. Smith leaves the convention in a huff, returns to Albany without waiting for Roosevelt to show up or to congratulate anybody. And there's a question of whether Smith is going to endorse Roosevelt that year. And he does not really until they have to get together in the same place at the same time, and that place is Albany, at the old, at the Armory, where they're holding the Democrat State Convention. They have to nominate a successor to Roosevelt, and they agree on who that should be. That's going to be Herbert Lehman. And Tammany does not want Lehman. Smith and Roosevelt do. So they have to come together. And when politicians come together, what do? They pretend to like each other. And so they do, and Smith says, "Oh, you old potato, yeah, Frank, my old pal," and it's all kiss and make up. Well, they kiss and make up until Roosevelt gets into office, when Smith is going to endorse Alf Landon, the Republican, in 1936, and he comes back to Albany to appear at Harmonis Bleecker Hall to give a speech against Roosevelt. This is not Harmonis Bleecker Library. It's not that little building, because you get like 12 people in there. Harmonis Bleecker Hall was an old-time theater, which is now, the site of that is the Albany Public Library. And he says, "I don't know whether Roosevelt's a communist or a socialist or whatever, but I don't want him." And this is the break, finally, between Smith and the Democratic Party. The next guy running, and it's New York versus New York, like it was, in 2016, is in 1944, Thomas E. Dewey versus Franklin Roosevelt. Dewey had been the big gangbusters district attorney in Manhattan, runs for governor against Lehman when he's very, very young, narrowly loses, wins in 42. Even before that, he leads on the first 3 ballots of the Republican National Convention in 1940. He comes upstate. Unlike a lot of our recent governors, he actually lives in Albany, kind of settles in. He becomes a vestryman at the Episcopal Church in town. His sons go to Albany Academy. Al Smith, I think it helps if you have a really big family, if you want to live in Albany, because of that nice big house they give you, as opposed to a small apartment in New York. So Theodore Roosevelt, with all those kids, he's going to live in the executive mansion. Al Smith had a big family. He lived in the executive mansion. He had a zoo at the executive mansion. He loved animals. He actually had a key to the Central Park Zoo in New York afterwards, and he could just wander in after hours. And Franklin Roosevelt spent a lot of time in the executive mansion. His campaign in 1932 is delayed because he has to hold hearings on the corruption of Mayor Walker in New York. And he holds those not in New York City, not in the state capitol, but he holds them in the executive mansion. So you have all those Albany connections. Dewey, of course, loses in 48. Truman comes into campaign against Dewey. He comes into the train station in the rainstorm at 8 o'clock in the morning. Thousands of people are there to greet him. He attacks the Republicans on trade agreements, of all things. It's like, whoa, we're back in 2016 again. And he goes, Dewey has left town. He's not going to be in town when Truman shows up, when the President of the United States shows up. And he goes down to dedicate the Alfred E. Smith houses on the Lower East Side. Everything comes around in these talks of mine. But it's instructive that day, Truman gives 15 speeches in a single day. He's heading west, and every single little whistle stop. So, the little engine that could literally, with Harry Truman. Now, a guy we don't associate with the presidency comes up very quickly from New York. His name is Averell Harriman. Harriman had been a very trusted advisor of Truman. He had been involved with Roosevelt in all those late in the war negotiations. He's fourth in the vote totals in 1952 at the Democratic Convention. And aside from Adlai Stevenson, he's the only Democrat to get votes in 1956. And I have actually met in the last year Averell Harriman's campaign manager, or convention manager that year, who is the film director Whit Stillman. If you've never seen any of his films, they're all very good. But Harriman loses in 1958. to Nelson Rockefeller, who immediately wants to be President Nelson Rockefeller, gets a campaign up and going. He's commissioned some polling. By December 1959, he pulls the plug on his campaign. He has a certainly rocky road to not the White House. The executive mansion burns down around him just about. And he has a messy divorce, which sinks him in 1964 during the California primary to Barry Goldwater, because on the eve of that primary, his second wife, Happy, gives birth to their son and reminds everyone of what difficulties, marital difficulties, Nelson Rockefeller has had, and people do not care for that in 1964. He becomes vice president under Gerald Ford. And after that, it's really a question of people just sort of blowing in and campaigning on the way to the White House. So Ronald Reagan in 1980 came into Colonie, and Rosalind Carter spoke from the Capitol steps at one point. John Anderson, who ran against Reagan and Carter in 1980, appeared at the podium at the University of Albany. It appeared before 4,000 students and said, Ronald Reagan is irrelevant. Not exactly true. He just died, I think a couple months ago. Barack Obama had visited the area about 3 times during his presidency. Only one stop could really be called sort of a campaign stop over at the Nano Center. George Pataki never really, or Mario Cuomo, never really got going with any sort of presidential bid. Last time out in 2016, we saw all sorts of presidential candidates appearing. We saw in the area anyway. Ted Cruz appeared in Schenectady. John Kasich in Schenectady, both in Schenectady County. Cruz was actually in Scotia. And Hillary appears in Cohoes, not paying any attention to Chester Arthur's sister. But Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump campaigned directly in Albany, as you may recall. Bernie at the Armory. Trump at the Pepsi Arena, about 10,000 people showed up. He was defending New York values against Ted Cruz, and started out by saying, is there anything in the world more fun than a Donald Trump rally? And the answer would be yes, a talk at the William K. Sanford Colonie Town Library. And with that, I will conclude and open the floor to questions.